I'm often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and Marlo.
Today we are joined by Mary Harrington. Mary is a contributing editor at UnHerd and a self-titled reactionary feminist. Mary, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
This week for our listener question, Hannah asks, what current movement in progressivism is most decisively dangerous to womankind? So this question is perfect for you, Mary.
I would say, and I would say the most dangerous strand of the progressive movement for women is the one that seeks to unmoor identity from the body. Now, it would be easier for me just to dive straight in and say this is all about people who feel that their gender doesn't align with their physiology. But in my view, and as I've argued in a number of different places, actually the field is much broader than that. In a sense, the very emotive issue of people who obviously feel genuinely uncomfortable and ill at ease in their bodies is functioning as a wedge issue. For a much wider project, which is about, in a sense, deregulating human nature, and is about opening up the human body to all sorts of biomedical interventions. And it's my view that that's particularly a danger to women, because women are the gateways to new human life, and as such, we're a particularly potentially lucrative source of biomedical interventions, particularly when you start considering experiments with fetal tissue, extrauterine gestation, surrogacy, commercial surrogacy, which is an enormous multinational industry now, which regularly hits the press for the appalling side effects it has, whether it's in terms of the exploitation of women or children who are abandoned because they're born with with disabilities of mental or physical disabilities, and who are then rejected by the quote unquote commissioning parents, as if they were a consumer product which can be sent back to the shop if it's faulty, rather than a living human being, worthy of love and dignity like everybody else. So women as the gateways to new human life are inevitably going to be at the forefront of of a deregulated biomedical industry that seeks to colonize and marketize the human body. While I have an enormous amount of sympathy for individuals who feel that their sense of who they are doesn't align with their physical presence in the world, I'm also deeply concerned about what's marching in behind that highly emotive agenda.
Now, do you think that with COVID, especially, and this kind of reverence for medical experts, have you seen this trend accelerate, or has it specifically concerned you that this deregulation of human nature paired with medical, the technocracy that's emerging, has that concerned you at all? Especially from, someone who is based in Britain, how has that trend influenced what you think about this?
Well, it's interesting because I think this is one of those areas where it's incredibly culturally specific how that dynamic is playing out. I think it's certainly observable, across the developed world, that a kind of biomedical technocracy is coming into focus through the medium of COVID. In a sense, its delivery, its principal vector now for sort of realizing itself is the pandemic, but that in a sense was waiting in the wings already. A lot of what's now coming in under the rubric of vaccine passports was waiting in the wings anyway, in the form of one kind of an ID card or another. In a sense, they just pressed play on a record that was already there. But how these things are inflected does seem to vary a lot depending on geography. When I think about the discourse in Britain, for example, is quite different to the discourse in America. To be fair, I can only get a sense of what's happening in America over the internet, where everything, all discourse is unhinged on the internet. So I imagine at ground level in sort of Nowheresville, in somewhere in the flyover states, the people are a great deal more grounded and pragmatic about it than they are online, where everybody's crazy. But my sense is that some places are considerably more extreme in their response and in their willingness to eliminate all socio-cultural sort of normative human considerations in favour of a kind of perfectly hygienic biomedical model of society. I mean, I was genuinely shocked, for example, by photographs from a California kindergarten of preschool-aged children masked and separated in playgrounds. This is something which would be literally unthinkable in the United Kingdom, where preschool-aged children are exempted, under 12s actually, are exempted from wearing masks. I think nobody has to wear a mask now anyway, but under 12s never had to wear a mask, which seemed to me sort of basically humane. And preschool-aged children were not locked down after the first initial round of lockdowns, which I literally wept with relief actually when they announced that there would be another lockdown, but that preschool-age settings would stay open. Because I have my daughter's now 5 and she was 3 when the first lockdown happened. And being an only child, she didn't see another kid at that point for months. And by the end of it, she was so profoundly depressed that she would climb into bed and turn her face to the wall. And that's not something I ever want to see in a 3-year-old again. And I suspect that, I mean, this is a well-resourced, loving, stable 2-parent household, materially comfortable, etc. And I can't even begin to imagine what that looked like in families which were more unstable, but less well-resourced, more chaotic, perhaps struggling with other social issues. It's literally unthinkable. And I hear from teacher friends that the cost of pandemic control measures in schools, particularly among deprived children, has been just astronomical. And I think this is something which is woefully under-discussed. There was also an extraordinary recent piece in The Atlantic where somebody was saying, young children are spending all day wearing masks, in childminder settings, sort of pre-kindergarten, infant daycare settings, and as a result are struggling to learn ordinary social cues and ordinary social interactions because they're just not accustomed to seeing faces. But hey, this is fine. Maybe we can teach them other stuff instead. And I was looking at this thinking, what is wrong with you? Just how can you look at what's happening to your child and not just be incensed at the price that people are willing to pay for a sort of antiseptic understanding of what and how, what people are and how we interact, and fundamentally what children need at the human level. And how is it that even now you're not willing to ask the question, actually, is this a price we're willing to pay?
Yeah, it's almost a lot of the COVID technocracy has sort of, it's become almost like it's part of the identity, almost like a religious identity. And so there's very little reason, within certain pockets, whether it's especially out in California or in certain cities, like it's very much core to, if you have the mask, if you wear a mask, even if you're vaccinated, like it's a sign of purity. And I think it extends to what's going on with children. So before we move on to the rest of the interview, I just want to thank Hannah for that listener question. And to other listeners out there, if you'd like to submit a question for the next episode, just leave a review of the show wherever you're listening and put that question in the review, or DM us on social media. You can find us on all platforms at ISI.
Now for our books of the week. Mary, what are you reading right now? I know that you're actually working on a book too. Is that right?
I am. As usual, I'm reading several things at once. Because I'm working on a book, I'm spending a certain amount of time immersed in reading stuff which I don't agree with, or that I end up furiously screenshotting and sending to my friends, every second page, which makes it a very slow read, but quite a kind of rich, quite a rich conversation. And the two I screenshot and send around most furiously at the moment are Revenge of the Real by Benjamin Bratton, who's perhaps the most mask-off, if you'll pardon the pun, exponent of this cyborg theocracy, this sort of religious vision of an antiseptic biomedical technocracy as the ideal progressive future for human flourishing. I highly recommend it. It makes me feel so. I can only read it in short bursts because it makes me feel a little bit ill. But I strongly recommend it as a book that really does say the quiet parts out loud in terms of what precisely is coming over the horizon if people don't mobilize some fairly bracing counter arguments fairly swiftly. And the other book, which is very much in a similar vein, is Full Surrogacy Now by Sophie Lewis, subtitle Feminism Against Family, in which she argues that, in fact, we should treat all gestation of children as something akin to surrogacy, and that this ought to be understood as a feminist project in order radically to liquefy what remains of the traditional family in the interests of progress, freedom, utopia, etc. She's an extremely good prose stylist, even though I disagree with absolutely everything she says. Again, I highly recommend it as actually a very coherent exposition, very coherent, very logical exposition of what feminism looks like if you accept as inescapable all of the priors which I fundamentally reject about all relationships being transactional, about embodiment being optional, and about the progressive direction of travel for society being a desirable one. If you accept all of those things, then Sophie Lewis's Full Surrogacy Now is a pretty clear and is a pretty convincing argument about where we ought to be heading, in the interests of social justice. So again, I recommend it, even though I disagree with pretty much everything in it. I've also just finished Erika Bachiochi's The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Legacy, which I highly recommend for the opposite reasons, because it's clear, meticulous, beautifully researched, extremely well written, and shows a moral clarity which is wildly absent from pretty much every piece of progressive writing I read these days, which tends to be mired in word salad and a sort of peculiarly garbled moral compass, which I still haven't fully got to grips with, such as to be able to characterize it, but which, like I said with Benjamin Bratton, leaves me feeling strangely disoriented, and like I'm in a world where people just don't fully have the same conception of what it means to be human as I do, which is a very disorienting experience. I mean, these are things that you sort of take for granted at some level, and I don't think we can take that for granted anymore, that we share a common conception of what it means to be human. Anyway, I recommend Erika's book as a beautiful exposition of what a dignitarian feminism could look like in a world where actually we do center the human, and we do center an understanding of ourselves as bounded, embodied, limited, human, and owing a measure of compassion and fellowship to one another.
Thank you, Mary. Johnny, what are you reading this week? Yeah,
well, I'm just going to do a quick plug for an article I read yesterday, actually at UnHerd. And Mary, you might have to help me with the pronunciation of his name, Aris Roussinos, or Ari Roussinos.
Yeah.
He has a book on Crisis is the New Normal and the left's embrace of globalization. And he sort of recovers a lost history of the anti-globalization movement. And then he talks specifically about how that's impacted agriculture and agricultural workers and the food supply in Britain. So it's a fantastic piece at UnHerd, Crisis is the New Normal. Marla, what about you?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, UnHerd has had some, obviously, Mary, you're one of them, some great writers. One of my favorite pieces, which I'm going to plug, Aris, is he wrote this piece, I think it was a few years ago, on Tory anarchism. So if anyone's interested in kind of the British take on a lot of issues that Americans can map onto as well, UnHerd's a great platform for that. As far as what I'm reading, I'm actually reading a magazine this week since I'm traveling and don't have much time to pick up a book that I'm not going to, have disruptions and have to put down repeatedly. So I'm actually reading the Lamp 6th issue, which includes a few of my favorite writers and writers I find interesting, like Giorgio Agamben. We were talking about the medical religion briefly earlier, so he writes about that. Josh Craddock, who writes about abortion and the Constitution a lot. I really appreciate his takes, and also Sam Criss and my friend Michael Brennan Doherty. So the Lamp's really a go-to for me, especially when I'm on the road. So I'm happy to see that they have a new issue out, actually. So this one's a dated one, but Yeah, so without further ado, I want to, jump into this interview with Mary. And I kind of want to just start out with learning a little bit about your personal journey with feminism, which you write a lot about. And, you're going to appear at National Conservative Conference in Orlando in a few weeks, and you'll be speaking about such issues. And I want to learn about how your views on social issues and feminism have developed. You've written extensively about it, and you even have a blog called Reactionary Feminist. So you're pretty critical about contemporary iterations of feminism, as you just described, while being sympathetic to some ideas from feminism itself. So how did you come to make sense of what feminism and different social issues and paradigms mean to you?
There's a long answer to that and a short answer. I guess the short answer is I spent my 20s being a radical leftist, about as radical as it's possible to be, short of, sort of going and living up a tree. And over the course of doing that, I came to the conclusion that, I came to several conclusions, one of which was that hierarchy cannot be done away with, and therefore the pursuit of radical egalitarianism is just, it's a fool's errand. It's for the birds. And a lot of things follow. A lot of questions for feminist thinking fall out of that conclusion, as I'm sure you can imagine. And another conclusion that I came to was that I stopped believing in progress, and I also stopped believing in the patriarchy. I'll just unpack that a little bit. When I say I don't believe in progress, I don't mean I don't believe that things ever change. I don't mean that I think nothing ever gets better or that everything's always getting worse. But what I mean is I don't believe that we're on some sort of ineluctable upward journey towards some imaginary future secular heaven on earth. I don't believe that's a thing. Some things get better, some things get worse. But for every index, I mean, fundamentally, if you want to say, progress is happening, then in order to be able to explain that, compared to all of the other things which are getting worse, you have to define what you mean by progress. And the moment you've done that, you've begged the question, because the moment you've set the terms for progress, in a sense, you've already skewed, you've cleared the pitch in your favour. So long and the short of it, I stopped believing in progress. And again, that left me with some questions where my well-entrenched feminism was concerned. I mean, for historical reasons, I've long been a feminist. My dad was a pretty reactionary old dinosaur, and I grew up in a household where the sex roles and, if you like, the status was very unequally divided between my parents in a way which obviously made my mum unhappy. I grew up angry about that, as you can imagine, being the only girl. There were some sort of structural injustices that seemed baked into the givens of sex in a way which I felt just needed just called for a political answer in the name of justice. So I mean, if you could think of that, I suppose, as a sort of basic orientation toward life, or to put it another way, I grew up with a chip on my shoulder about misogyny. But once you put that chip once you put that chip together with a loss of faith in the idea of progress and some very basic questions about what actually being in a sexed body means, and I'll explain how I found myself questioning that in a moment. You realise that a lot of what's become pop feminist orthodoxy just doesn't really hang together anymore. This idea that the trajectory of feminism through various different kinds of emancipation is always and only one of liberation for everybody. That admits of some questions, and also the question of what exactly it is that we're trying to achieve becomes a whole lot more complicated, and the question of what exactly is feminism trying to do becomes a great deal is suddenly thrown wide open. If it's not about just emancipating ourselves from men, and if there isn't actually some sort of eternal patriarchal conspiracy to keep us down, and I really don't think there is. I mean, there are patriarchal cultures, and there are oppressions of women by men. But I think the texture of how those scenarios emerge is considerably more complicated and is inflected as much by the material conditions of a society as it is by the cultural and the if you like, the cultural practices and sort of entire inherited sort of meme landscape of a particular culture. Anyway, look, this was meant to be the short answer, but the long and the short of it was I started my 20s as a radical lefty. I ended it having lost all of my illusions and delusions and dreams of a progressive egalitarian future, and finding myself, on a sort of blasted ideological heath where I just wasn't really sure what I believed in anymore. So I left London. I trained as a psychotherapist and just decided I was going to throw myself into, I got married. I threw myself into family life and figured I'm just going to get on with being a normie. And I spent most of my 30s just getting on with being a normie. I had a child. And it was when my daughter got to 2 or 3. By a sheer accident, somebody said, "Oh, Mary, you should start writing again. You're always really good at it." And it just happened that I was at a point where I had a bit more time because my daughter got a bit older, and I suppose, when you're mumming with a small child, it's not as though your brain switches off. People on both sides of the aisle, on the right and the left, treat stay-at-home mums as if because women are doing this, our brains are not functioning. But of course, this is not the case. There are plenty of highly educated, extremely thoughtful people who just happen whose work happens not to fall within the terms of the market. And for a while, I was one of them. While I was hoovering the stairs, I had plenty of time to think about politics and culture. I was fairly directly Bluetoothed into I was fairly addicted to Twitter as a consequence of spending a lot of time breastfeeding. And so I started writing, and 2.5 or so years later, here I am. This is really just me trying to put into words a bunch of stuff that's happened to me over the last 42 years, and trying to put it all together. A stint as a radical, a stint as a normie, and I suppose now I've sort of stumbled into public life as somebody who's trying to make sense of where those pieces do or don't fit together, because my sense is that the world has abruptly arrived at a point where the radicals and the normies are colliding in a much more direct sense than used to be the case, partly as a consequence of the internet, but also partly just because of where we are economically and culturally, particularly now that everybody's wildly online, thanks to COVID.
Hey listeners, let me recommend another podcast for you to tune into if you're fans of conservative conversations with ISI. It's called The New Thinkery, and it stars a trio of conservative professors who don't take themselves all that seriously, even while talking about the most serious philosophical topics one can imagine. In short, it's a podcast devoted to political philosophy and its history, along with its many guises in literature, film, and human experience generally. They have done episodes on Plato, Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Pick a topic or thinker in the history of Western civilization, and they've touched on it. And they also have guest episodes with your favorite political theorists like Larry Cooper, Jan Blitz, Jim Caesar, and Flag Taylor. You can find The New Thinkery anywhere you find your podcasts. You can also find them on Facebook, The New Thinkery, and Twitter, @The New Thinkery. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
Mary, one of the phrases you mentioned stood out to me. You said, whose work happens to fall outside of the market. And so I'm curious, where do you think kind of this idea that if your work is not connected to the market economy, then it's not really legitimate work? Where do you think that idea came from?
Well, actually, perversely, or perhaps not perversely, that idea has become central to what people think of as feminism today. I mean, I argued recently in American Affairs that what we think of today as feminism can also be read as women's campaign to enter the market on the same terms as men. From an agrarian society where almost nobody was worked in the market. People worked for the most part in America in the early 19th century in subsistence farming, and women worked alongside men, and life was just organized very differently. By the end of the 19th century, there were more industrial workers than there were agrarian workers, and society was very different. And the role and sex roles changed radically over the course of that transition. And I would actually argue that the transition into industrial society radically disempowered women in some ways which are not often noted, at least not in the progressive narrative, in the sense that yes, women didn't have the franchise. Yes, women were not able to own property, but at the practical everyday level, women had considerably more agency and considerably more economic participation within an agrarian society. The most ordinary women were multi-skilled, extremely active people who worked alongside men, processing the raw materials that were produced by men into food or clothing or other goods for the family, and sometimes to sell. This is not a disempowered life, while simultaneously raising a huge brood of children, in a thickly embedded, problem in many cases large extended family. That's not a disempowered life. Many of these women were self-taught, highly educated, extremely motivated, and remarkable individuals. But under an industrial society, a lot of what worked for women as a source of meaning abruptly fell away. In that, so suddenly the role of women is, rather than being a sort of economic agent in your own right, a lot of women found that they lived lives of relative idleness. Their job was to educate children or to manage the servants and to buy stuff. Which is a pretty thin source of meaning compared to an active agrarian life in many. I mean, it might have been. I imagine it was a considerably easier work, considerably less backbreaking, but in other ways, very sort of attenuated by comparison. And so not unreasonably, women and also women lost power just in terms of in terms of access to resources and a sense of contributing to society. And women rationalized this in different ways. There was the so-called cult of domesticity, which wanted to make the positive case for women staying out of the market and for looking after children and being, if you like, the repository for higher moral values. In a sense, that's the kind of that forms the sort of precursor to such conservative feminisms as exist today. You can see traces of the cult of domesticity in the 20th century, for example, in Phyllis Schlafly. But other women said, no, actually, this doesn't make sense, and this is never going to fly. And we want personhood and political participation on the same terms as men. And so, ineluctably, the stage is set for women's equal ownership of property, and eventually for women obtaining the franchise. And then, and then when material conditions changed again over the course of the 20th century, you see another push for agency. As women got disempowered in a sense all over again with the rise of the market society, the consumer society, and also of labor saving devices, which just took away most of the work of the home, such that all of a sudden you've got a class of sometimes extremely highly educated women who are basically sitting around doing nothing apart from taking their kids to school and then picking them up again. And I'm being incredibly reductive here, and of course it's much more textured than that. But it's also not unreasonable for some of the suburban housewives finding themselves leading relatively atomized and relatively idle lives of empty consumption to say, no, actually this isn't enough. And we want to be engaged in the world, we want to be engaged in what world there is to be engaged in, and so they want it out into the marketplace. But of course that then raises the question of who actually is going to pick up the work of care, and this is I think the question that nobody's really been able to answer yet.
I just wanted to draw off of that point that you made, especially in the American Affairs article, and through these shifting material conditions in post-industrial society, something you draw attention to is the deep divide between what you've called bourgeois women's class interests, which uses the language of feminism, and the interests of the rest of women, perhaps women who are not as interested in climbing the corporate ladder or just don't share the same lifestyle priorities as this class of women. Can you explain how this cleavage between these classes of women informs our cultural understanding of feminism? And when we see popular depictions of feminism, who do you think is it really depicting or reflecting the interests of?
Well, it's my observation. I live in small town England, and it's my observation that the vast majority of women don't have careers, they have jobs. And against that backdrop, it makes a great deal less sense to talk about balancing career and family, or rather sacrificing family for career. And yet, if you look at the conversation which happens in centres of power, I can't speak quite as much to the American discourse here, but certainly drawing from the conversation that happens in British politics, every single British major political party at the last election made the centrepiece of its offer to women the one or another offer of more funding for childcare, as if it's just axiomatic that what women want is less time to spend with their children. And it's by no means obvious to me that that's invariably the case. You know, there are plenty of studies have shown that for most women, by far the majority of women, some kind of, though there's a minority of maybe 10 or 20% who just want to spend all of their time working. You know, there's a minority of women who are very career motivated, very career driven. Some of them will have kids, some of them won't. But that's maybe 20%. There's 20% who just don't want to work at all, given the choice. And for the remaining 60%, some kind of a balance is optimal. You know, when you live in a world where there are washing machines, and you know we're not all subsistence farmers, right? And we're not going back to that world anytime soon. It's not like we need to spend all of our time in the home just managing all the things that there are to manage. Most people don't have 6 kids anymore, but and therefore it makes sense for us to be doing something else as well. You know, most people find that an enriching source of meaning in our lives, but by far the majority would prefer not to spend 60-hour weeks working at that because we like our children. It shouldn't be considered heretical to say that. You know, actually, we quite like to be able to spend a bit more time with our children. And one of the causes which I almost never see taken up is the one of, you know, so some kind of, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man or woman to come up with some kind of a subsidy which evens the options between putting your kid into funded childcare and finding some way of doing that yourself, should you wish to. I don't know. I think the situation in America varies depending on where you are, but in the UK, you get a certain number of free hours of funded childcare from when your kid is a toddler onwards. It seems strange to me that nothing equivalent exists for people who want to spend that proportion of their week caring for their own children. It amounts to a marginal penalisation of people who want to spend time with their kids. You know, and as you pointed out, Johnny, you know, the value that's placed on work, which can be measured in wages, is so much greater and is so much greater than the value placed on work that falls outside that. You know, work which is oriented towards care and oriented towards looking after dependents. Is weighed as nothing in comparison to that. And I think one of the themes that I come back to often is the difficulty of balancing women's desire for autonomy within the terms of the world that we exist in, you know, where most work is waged and most people live according to the dicta of a market society, against the instinct that most parents have, but particularly mothers of very young children have, to acknowledge that in fact some things can't be pursued according to the logic of the market, and central to that is the needs of dependent loved ones, but particularly of very young children.
Something interesting we discussed a few episodes back was radical feminist Andrea Dworkin, who Sara Bamari, a previous show guest, references in his latest book about tradition. Specifically, Dworkin was interested in the power imbalances, which you've been talking about, that, you know, largely influence the emergence of feminist movements. But she speaks about the power imbalances that existed within prostitution, and she was anti-pornography for the same reason. What's odd today is how defensive social libertarians are about porn, and I've written quite a bit about porn, its influence on culture and women and families, but any criticism today is met with accusations of being a theocrat or a woman hater. What I kind of want to see your take on is what happened between Dworkin's criticism of pornography and the view today. What changed that made social liberals so accepting of it? What has made women, who are identifying as feminists, accepting of it? And do you see that changing at all based on maybe a sense of disaffection with the current political order?
Erika Bachiochi, whose book I recommended earlier in this program, argues convincingly, I think, that with the legalization of abortion, a central question of feminism was settled, which is to say, an argument which had been raging pretty much from Mary Wollstonecraft onwards about whether or not the embodied domain of care should be the central focus of feminism, or whether egalitarianism on the, following taking the male body and the atomized subject as a default should be the central focus of feminism. And Erika argues, I think very persuasively, that with the embrace of legal abortion as a means of attaining personhood on the same terms as men, feminism embraced definitively the logic of the market. I think she makes a very persuasive case for that. And I've reflecting on that chapter, which hit very hard for me because it implies some conclusions which I'm sort of uncomfortable to voice out loud at this point. Particularly, it would take me a long way from my 20-something radical leftism. But reflecting on that chapter, I've found myself thinking that if this is the case, then in fact feminism ended with the legalization of abortion. And we are now 50 or 60 odd years into whatever it was that followed on from feminism, that might be wearing the cloak of women's rights like a skin suit, but is in fact something else. I'm not quite sure what to call it. A friend of mine, Ardian Tola, calls it cyborg theocracy. I'm not quite ready to drop that one, or I'm not quite ready to unpack that one, But certainly, I think there's a case for saying, no, in fact, we're 60 years out beyond feminism into something else, which is perhaps I've called it elsewhere kind of biolibertarianism, which is to say, a pursuit of emancipation from all of embodiment. That started out with feminism, incubated within feminism, but with the declaration of biomedical victory over the beginning of life, subject to individual whims. We're out into new territory. We're out beyond an embrace of embodiment, and we're into a new terrain. So that I suppose, by way of a sort of very broad brush answer to your question, what changed? What changed since Dworkin's time and now is that we're several decades further into a widespread sociocultural acceptance of biolibertarianism, which is to say, the right of every human individual to have full and complete control over his or her own body, to the extent of being entitled to monetize it at whim, and entitled to consume others' bodies that are subject to a sort of performance of consent on both sides. So, but I don't know if that makes sense. I'm sort of some distance out of a feminist frame here. But I think we need to understand what's happening now, within the wider context of feminist history, but whilst remaining open to the possibility that in fact everything which obtained throughout industrial era feminism is now no longer applicable, because we're somewhere new.
Mary, sorry, go ahead, Marla. You had a follow up there.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Johnny.
Well, I was just going to ask about kind of conservative, or what has, kind of traditionally been a conservative critique or opposition to feminism. One thing that I think is different based on the narrative that you're presenting is that often conservative critics of feminism really locate the causes of it in primarily so exclusively kind of like social issues, or maybe critical theory, sort of ideology. It's very much a cultural critique. But what I hear you saying in terms of biolibertarianism is kind of really the entrance of this sort of market logic into a domain that maybe was designed to be more private or familial, where the laws of the market don't really apply. And so I'm curious. In the United States, at least, there has been kind of, especially in the last few years, this, bomb throwing going back and forth between the more libertarian right and the social conservative right, and different visions of economics. So I'm just kind of curious from your vantage point, what do you see are as some of maybe the inconsistencies of conservatives kind of grappling with issues relating to feminism, gender, transgenderism?
I think it's certainly the case that a right libertarian response to a lot of these issues tends instinctively to want to privatize issues and difficulties which I would think of, properly speaking, as social, or really as concerning the common good. And this is particularly of concern to women, where it comes to the obligations, or, if you like, and to an extent the constraints placed on women by having children and caring for dependents. To put it more plainly, being a radical individualist is just not compatible with being a mother of small children. It just isn't. And if you try, then you're going to have some very screwed up kids, or you're going to get taken away by the police. That if your baby is screaming for milk at 4 o'clock in the morning, you can't just not go and feed them because you don't want to. And there's a strand of libertarianism on the right that simply holds that people shouldn't be obliged to do anything that they don't want to do. And taken to its logical extreme, that means leaving your baby to starve if you don't want to feed them. This is obviously absurd. I mean, and this is not a position I've ever heard a libertarian take. But once you apply the logic of personal choice and personal responsibility to the field of care and dependency, you just very obviously very quickly start running into problems. I mean, returning to the question of ending an accidental pregnancy, I actually just today written an essay where I argued against a quote-unquote assisted dying, which is a live issue in the United Kingdom at the moment. There's yet another bill has been proposed to legalise it in limited cases. And my argument against it draws from what happened following the legalisation of abortion, in which, on the one hand, it was beneficial to women who found themselves in that predicament. But on the other hand, it also reduced social pressure on men to step up in the case, after having caused an accidental pregnancy. And as a consequence, there was a rapid drop in shotgun marriages, which far out, and the drop in shotgun marriages so far outstripped the number of women who are willing to abort an accidental pregnancy, that in fact, rather than reducing instances of single motherhood, actually the legalization of abortion increased it. It had a completely paradoxical effect. But the other effect that it had was to enable the emergence of a right libertarian discourse, which said that which implicitly argues that given that women have the option to abort an accidental pregnancy, then the choice to go through with it and the responsibility of caring for the resulting child as a single mother should be wholly hers. And what emerges from that on the right is a conjunction of personal responsibility discourse with a kind of callous disregard for the needs of dependents that basically says, single mothers, because they at some point had the option not to be single mothers, should just be left to shoulder their burdens alone, and we as a society have no obligation to get involved in that. And my argument in the context of assisted dying is that it's fairly straightforward to see how a similar right libertarian argument could be applied to somebody who's facing a terminal illness with the option legally to end their life. And I don't want to live in a world where there are right libertarians writing op-eds saying that somebody facing terminal cancer who refuses to end their life early is a drain on the public purse. I do not want to live in that world. So I don't know if that answers your question about where I see the libertarian end of the right as running into conflict, perhaps with the more common good. End of with the more common good arguments that you see emerging from the social conservative right. But it ought to be fairly clear that it's much easier to argue in women's actual grounded, embodied political interests from a socially conservative perspective than it is from a right libertarian one.
Do you think that with a rising populist or maybe common good sentiment that prioritizes or doesn't outwardly neglect the needs and the desires of of different classes of people who aren't perhaps this elite caste of women, especially who do kind of proffer the feminist feminist dogma as it's understood today. Do you think that type of class consciousness, I guess I don't want to use the Marxist term, but I guess I will here, could help almost realign where the right and left are in regards to feminism? Do you think that there can be an emerging a feminist cause that is more aligned with its origin from the right, perhaps one that prioritizes the needs of the mother as caretaker, and also because women do work as someone who has, or even just has the option to take, fathers and paternity leave, mothers taking maternity leave, trying to integrate these different different types of humane policies into the workplace and into the home. Do you see that occurring, or do you think that the corporate stronghold on feminism is just too pungent for any type of humane, or maybe this would be the reactionary feminism you're talking about? Would you say that that's a possibility, or has it been in the last decade or so?
I can tell you those conversations are happening because I'm part of them. I would say that it's pretty marginal at the moment relative to the sort of liberal feminist industrial complex, which is by comparison absolutely hegemonic. And in as much as there are those of us who are trying to think through in a grounded way what constitute women's material interests, what constitute women's interests in the world as it is now, rather than in the world of some never-ending progress and ever-increasing abundance that is now receding in the rearview mirror. Those conversations are happening. They're pretty marginal at the moment, but I'm cautiously optimistic that they will attract more attention and more interest as we get further away from the industrial era and further into whatever the age is now that we're living in, the age of biolibertarianism. I think perhaps for normie women, the gateway drug to reactionary feminism is probably getting to grips with what in fact the transgender movement means for women's interests on the ground. For normie women, that looks like suddenly discovering that there's a boy on their daughter's sports team. And while that can very easily degrade into straightforward culture war stuff, for thoughtful women who mobilize to question this and to say, it forms, who mobilize to question this, it opens the door to a lot of questions about, what exactly does it mean to be a woman? In what sense does it really make sense to pursue an egalitarian agenda so radical that it asserts that one can be a woman even if one in fact was born with XY chromosomes and a penis? And if that's not the case, then what set of interests are we in fact fighting for? Once you follow the logic of that through beyond a certain point, then you find yourself asking some questions about some of the fundamental priors of egalitarian feminism. I think a lot of that there's an enormous amount of scope for a new round of the very rich and fertile and very fractious debates that have happened within feminism for some 3 centuries now. But I'm also of the view that this is no longer a conversation that we can just have amongst women. Over the course of the industrial era, much of the energy behind feminism has come from women saying, no, in fact, we want and need to be able to disaggregate ourselves from men and to be people in our own right. And I feel like, and my sense is we've taken that about as far as it's possible to go. What I see happening amongst young people now is a radical and actually disastrous implosion of the ability even to be around or be with the opposite sex. Something has gone very wrong in the ability of people in their 20s or younger to form relationships with one another, or to engage in healthy sexual intimacy, to even contemplate forming the kind of long-term pair bond that would enable people to have flourishing families. Something has gone profoundly wrong there. And I don't think that's something which women can solve on our own as a political movement. I think we need to consider, and we need to re-engage with men who are also very, very vocally and increasingly furiously amongst themselves thinking about these things. This is obvious if you pay any attention at all to the weird online right. And these conversations need to be happening between the sexes as well. And I'm also of the view that that's going to mean reckoning with some of liberal feminism's unpaid debts. Where it comes to collapsing families, the contribution it's made to atomization, to unhappy children, across a litany of areas, it's brought immense benefits to, perhaps predominantly upper class women in the developed world, but it's also come with a number of downsides, not all of which are willingly acknowledged by the people who are still pushing its agenda. So while I consider myself, very much still a feminist, I'm by no means an uncritical cheerleader for everything which has been achieved by the women's movement. And I think there's going to need to be a reckoning with some of the uncounted costs, and perhaps a conversation with men about how and where we negotiate some trade-offs, if we're going to be able to find a new way of living together in the world as it is now.
Mary, I have a public policy related question for you. You had mentioned earlier about childcare in particular, and the difference between the government just providing blanket childcare versus providing some sort of stipend where parents actually have the choice whether they want to spend time taking care of their own kids or whether they want to send them to childcare. I'm curious if on the public policy front, what are a few areas or policies that if you were in charge, that you would implement to achieve a society that's more pro-family, that's more pro, our embodied experience as men and women?
In terms of the United States, very straightforwardly, maternity leave. There are many things that are wonderful about your country, but I think it's absolutely barbarous that there's no blanket provision for mothers to stay at home with their children until they're at least 6 months old. As is the norm in most European countries, at least a few months of paid childcare, and I'm genuinely horrified to hear of mothers routinely being back at work while still bleeding postpartum. I think that it's frankly barbarous. I'm sorry, it's just monstrous, and it baffles me that a country which is otherwise proverbially committed to mum and apple pie should not see that and not reflect that in public policy. In the United Kingdom, that's a more difficult question, because it probably depends a great deal who you ask. But I think an emerging area where perhaps the interests of the socially conservative right converge with those of the emerging gig economy era proletariat would be far more thoughtful and targeted measures to support family life for people who earn their living in the gig economy. Whether that's actually measures just to rein the gig economy in full stop, which I would support, or measures to ensure that people who have caring responsibilities can actually meet those responsibilities, given an employment situation which could ask them to be working at any hour at the drop of a hat. I mean, Abigail Tucker, who wrote a book recently about mum science, the study of mums, reported that for the most part, the research indicates that mums who work are generally pretty happy with it. But the ones who are happy are the ones with predictable working schedules and a measure of flexibility. And the ones who are most miserable are the ones with 60-hour working weeks or an unpredictable working schedule. So I would say, that's, given that we're not going to be rolling things back to the 19th century sort of life of bourgeois domesticity and a male breadwinner anytime soon. That's just not going to happen. We should be thinking pragmatically about measures that are going to work today for supporting family life and enabling people actually to embrace caring responsibilities and to make those the centre of life. And particularly for those at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale who are currently at the mercy of gig economy platforms and the like.
Are there any anything in the UK or the US that you see particularly promising for these types of pro-family policies? You're speaking at NatCon, so you clearly are aware of some of the different movements occurring in the US that are drawing attention to perhaps deficiencies that exist in our popular portrayals and approach to family life, and especially with, I mean, the transgender question, like the issue that in America, especially, of whether people who are born male can play on the same team as girls, and whether that is what equality looks like, is certainly something that has concerned parents across the country, perhaps not ones who are very active online and who, portray this activism that is by no means representative of swaths of the country. But do you see anything that has brought you hope, that has made you think that perhaps we are now taking family life seriously, and not just for women, but also for men?
I don't see anything. I don't see anything concrete happening on the policy front that makes me particularly optimistic about that, I'm afraid. No, if there's one material change which has the potential to benefit at least parents who do knowledge work, if not people who have more physical occupations, has been the way the pandemic has broadened acceptance of remote work. That self-evidently increases the scope for people to work flexibly and part-time. I mean, in as much as I work at all, it's a function of the fact that the internet exists. I don't know how easy it would be for me to do the work that I do if it were assumed that in order to do it I had to go and sit in an office every day. There are plenty of other women like that, like me. But I mean, that comes with some trade-offs, because, for every woman like me who's enjoying the benefits of being able to work remotely as a member of the Zoom classes, there's another woman there's another parent or another person who's finding that Zoom work has infiltrated every aspect of his or her life, and that it's now increasingly difficult to switch off from that. I mean, being unable to switch off from from your work is fine if you love your work and you don't mind having it kind of constantly there in your pocket. But it's not so great if you have somebody who's installed a keystroke tracker on your laptop so they can monitor what you're doing when you're online working from home, and you don't like your job anyway. So I think we're in a new world which potentially has some upsides for some families, but is going to require a lot of careful thought about how we're going to mitigate potential downsides, whether it's on overwork or intrusiveness of digital surveillance into people's home lives, or new kinds of inequality emerging between people who have real IRL careers, if you like, and people who are able to work remotely.
Well, Mary, the question that we ask all of our guests, and that I'm very interested in seeing what your response to this is what is conservatism?
I could give you several different answers to that. One of them is it's just liberalism for people who want to get there more slowly.
Liberalism while driving the speed limit. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's a rather cynical answer. I mean, I think there's something to it, but it's a bit cynical and a bit defeatist. So I might throw back at you my favourite quote about reaction and the reactionary, which I think just works as a good counterpoint, from Nicolas Gómez Dávila, a Colombian recluse and polymath, who's an extraordinarily literate person who wrote in aphorisms, and who said once that a reaction, I'm paraphrasing, I think slightly, that a reactionary only becomes conservative when he thinks there's something worth conserving, but also that the true reactionary is not a seeker after abolished pasts, but a hunter of sacred shades on the eternal hills. And in as much as there's a conservatism worth pursuing, it's somewhere in that zone. About people have written 500 or 1,000-page books on the history of conservatism, so I'm not going to attempt to outdo those. But I would say if there's a conservatism worth signing up to, it's probably somewhere in the Dávila zone.
Well, on that note, thank you, Mary, so much for joining us today. If people are interested in following your work or following you personally, where can they find you?
I'm on Twitter as Moving Circles, and you can find me at UnHerd under the author list, Mary Harrington. My website is reactionaryfeminist.com. I intermittently, it's mostly work reposted from elsewhere, but you can get a flavour of the titles and the themes that I write about there.
And do you know when your book will be coming out? I saw that that's on your blog.
It's in progress at the moment. All with a following wind, I'll complete the manuscript sometime in the first half of next year. So I guess, again, with a following wind, it'll either be out towards the end of next year or early in 2022.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us, Mary. Upcoming on Conservative Conversations, look out for an episode of Jeff Paulette and Elizabeth Corey. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.